So hello and welcome everyone to this program on African American CCC enrollees in Pennsylvania State Forests. My name is Joshua Roth. I am the site administrator of the Pennsylvania Lumber Museum in Potter County, Pennsylvania. We are a part of the Pennsylvania Historical Museum Commission, which is PA's official state history agency. So I'd like to welcome everyone to the program tonight. Thank you for tuning in. We're very pleased to have Mr. Paul Fagley here to give this program on African Americans in the CCC in Pennsylvania. He's done a significant amount of research on the topic and has an interesting PowerPoint program that he will be presenting to you. As before, please keep your microphones muted during the program unless you are called on at some point to speak or ask your question. If you would like to ask a question, please put that in the chat feature and I will be monitoring that throughout. We also, by way of introduction, lest I forget, have Joshua Fox with us. He is the curator at the Pennsylvania Lumber Museum. Both Paul and Josh are co-hosts on this event, so they may be able to jump in and answer questions on the chat as well. So again, thank you everyone for attending. To our presenter, Mr. Fagley, thank you. And I will turn it over to you.
Okay, well, thank you, Josh. Just by way of introduction a little bit, let me bring up the thing here. I work for the Pennsylvania Bureau of State Parks. I work at Greenwood Furnace State Park. It's in Huntingdon County, about 20 miles or so south of State College. And I have been there for well over 30 years. And part of what I do is, in addition to the furnace history, is also do history around the area. Some of it involves the logging history around Greenwood and also the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC history. As part of our park complex, Greenwood Furnace is a complex, we manage 3 different state parks. In addition to Greenwood Furnace, we manage Whipple Dam State Park and also Penn Roosevelt State Park. Now, Penn Roosevelt is interesting because that is the site of one of the Black CCC camps that was in Pennsylvania. And you'll be seeing some pictures of that later on tonight in the program. So that is partially how I got interested in this topic. The other one was a couple of years ago, there was a request sent out from our Harrisburg office about what if we did any programs involving Black History Month or anything like that. And I sent back that I had done some history of Penn Roosevelt State Park and the Penn Roosevelt CCC camp. Well, it wasn't more than a few weeks later, I found out that I was asked to do a presentation for senior staff of the Department of Conservation Natural Resources, DCNR. I was asked to do a program on this, but not just on Penn Roosevelt, but all of the Black camps in Pennsylvania. So that kind of let me into a very quick research thing. And I found it to be a very interesting topic. Some unusual things popped up during the research. Some of this I had many discussions with a friend of ours. I'll talk about here in just a moment. And we helped to put this together, and he provided a lot of information to this program. So anyway, I want to take a moment here tonight and dedicate this program to this gentleman. It's John Eastlake. He was very much a passionate CCC researcher and historian, a retired forestry employee, and he just passed away last Saturday. And but he and I had many talks, and Josh knows him, and I'm sure maybe some of you might have run across him too. And sorry about that. As I said, I want to dedicate tonight's program to John. So anyway, this program is on African Americans and the CCC in Pennsylvania. And it's not meant to be a full-blown history of it. It doesn't get into a lot of it. This could be a real research topic, but it's just a little bit of perspective on what exactly we're talking about. And because of that, this is actually a work in progress. Some of the sources I've used for this and on here, we don't need to go read through them all, but just to see that I use several other sources that have talked both about the CCC in general and some history of the Black enrollment within the program. But anyway, to give you a little background, Civilian Conservation Corps lasted from 1933 until 1942. It was one of the programs passed by Franklin D. Roosevelt and passed by Congress. And it was in the first year or so, it was called the Emergency Conservation Work, or the ECW. The Civilian Conservation Corps name came about sometime during the first year, and it kind of took that as its official title in the second year. And of course, it's one of FDR's New Deal programs. And part of it was to reduce the high unemployment rate of young men, and also to perform conservation work, to put them to work out in the forests and such, doing work that was needed to be done. Interestingly, the American people embraced the program, making it perhaps the most popular of the New Deal programs. Despite the popularity with the public, though, Congress never made it a permanent program, and every year they had to basically reallocate funds for it. And after about the third or fourth year, it started becoming so much of a political thing that they kept cutting the budget every year. So the peak of the program was probably around 1935. Although it did last right up until the summer of 1942. And it still did a lot of work, but you see the peak number of camps and peak enrollment about 1935. In Pennsylvania, our governor at the time, Gifford Pinchot, if you're a forester, you should know that name. He was America's first professional forester. He also served 2 terms as governor of Pennsylvania, and these were 2 separate terms. They were not back-to-back terms, because at the time you could only serve one term at a time, then you had to leave office. So he served 1 in the 20s and 1 in the 30s. And he kind of thought along the same lines as the CCC. So when Roosevelt announced it, he really jumped in there right away, and Pennsylvania was able to take full advantage of the program. Most of the camps in Pennsylvania were actually under the Bureau of Forestry, which was at the time the Department of Forest and Waters. That's one of the forerunner agencies of what's now DCNR. The first camps in Pennsylvania opened in early May, less than a month after the first camps at a national level. So Pennsylvania was really at the beginning of this. In total, just under 195,000 Pennsylvanians would serve in the CCC. Most of them in Pennsylvania, but there were some Pennsylvania units and some individuals who were sent to other states, and that was not uncommon. They performed work in all 28 state parks that existed at the time. There are a lot more parks today. There are 122 parks today. Back then there were 28, and all forest districts at the time. So they did perform a lot of conservation work to support our state parks and forests. Well, during the Great Depression, times were very tough, and for African Americans, it was really doubly so. They were being already kind of near the bottom of the socioeconomic level. It was very hard for them to get employment. And so the Black youth unemployment rate was 2 to 3 times that of their white counterparts. So it really gives you an idea of the situation. Of course, at the time, segregation, discrimination was still very common in American society. And we were still operating under the Plessy versus Ferguson Supreme Court decision of 1896. And that basically held that racial segregation was legal as long as they were equal in quality. It became known as the separate but equal doctrine. And that does play into the CCC. The program was open to African American youth and World War I veterans. Part of that was that there was a Black congressman at the time that had language explicitly put in the legislation enacting it, that it forbade discrimination on the basis of race, creed, or ethnicity. So it was part of it. However, it did have some limitations to it. For one, it capped enrollment of Blacks at 10%, which was roughly equal to the US Black population at the time. Now, this 10% was not adjusted for state population differences. Some states had more, some had less. But the program nationally never really reached that 10% level. In Pennsylvania, what I found is, doing my research, is that the officials here did not really agree with this policy, and actually you'll see how this plays into it as I go through the program. Unlike a lot of the white men from it, who were largely from rural areas, most Black youth came from inner cities. Now you can imagine the culture shock here of taking someone from, say, downtown Philadelphia and sticking them in the woods with, miles from the nearest town. It was quite a culture shock for them. And FDR himself was reluctant to use the CCC to model social integration. And the Army pretty much had as much to blame to it as the program itself, because the Army had many attitudes at the time too that kind of held blacks within the military to the lesser roles. Well, according to what I found, it's stated kind of in some official histories that in the United States, there were around 100 black camps. Yet I ran across a newspaper article from December of 1935, which stated there were 250 camps. This is one of the big problems with the CCC, in that nobody really thought it would have much history to it after it was done, so a lot of the original paperwork was destroyed. They only kept some of it. So as a researcher, I found this out, and I know John talked about and others. Very often it's like finding the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle that have been scattered. Most of them are missing. You find a few of them, but you kind of have to piece it together and figure out what the whole puzzle looked like. So, you know, was it 100 or was it 250 as in this newspaper article? I really can't say at this point. I just put them both out there for what they are. In that same article, well, it is said that Pennsylvania had the highest number of camps at 17. Now, it lists 19 in that December 1935 article. Enrollment, about 200,000 or so nationwide, and about 30,000 black veterans, mostly from World War I. And now, as part of the program, they were segregated into units, and the term that they used at the time was colored units for these. And I'll show you how they designated that here in a few moments. There were only a couple actually integrated units. Because of the segregation, they were pretty much put off by their own. However, around the country, there were a few of these integrated units, not because somebody thought it would be good, but mainly because there were so few blacks that lived in that particular area of the country that they couldn't make up full units of 200. So they kind of were the first integrated units. Initially, all of the black units were overseen by white officers and what they called LEMs. You know, the government loves alphabet names. LEM stood for local experienced men. These were people that were hired in the local community, kind of as educators and leaders and such. And initially, the Army decreed that only white officers could lead black camps. But towards the end of the program, the first units were allowed to have full black officers with them. And I'll talk more about that in a few moments. These camps tended to be placed in the more remote areas. And they also had projects which tended to limit contact with local populations. However, they were paid the same as their white counterparts. They did not get less money. Typically, an enrollee earned $30 a month, $1 a day. They were allowed to keep $5 of it, the other 25% home to get their families off the local relief rolls. And that was true for all of them, not just the blacks. They all had to send 25 home. They could keep 5 as pocket money. They also tended to remain longer in the program. Generally, enrollment for white enrollees was about a year or so. And for blacks, it was about twice as long on average. And they did offer educational programs within the camps, tend to be nationwide. There were fewer opportunities. Pennsylvania seems to have bucked that trend and they actually had black educational officers that would go into the camps and such. So Pennsylvania, again, was bucking the national trend on that. Well, a lot of this had to do with the leader of it, the man whose name was Robert Fechner. And he was hired by Roosevelt to manage the program, and he actually died in the late 30s. And so he never was there for the ending, but he set a lot of the policies. Now, he was really hired because he was a Southerner, and it was kind of also, he was one of the head of the AFL labor union. So he was really hired there to placate the labor unions in the whole thing of the CCC, because the labor unions were initially against it. Now, one thing about Fechner is, even though he was one of the top union leaders, he fought very vociferously throughout his life that the CCC not be unionized. And because of that, they never were. There was never a union influence in the CCC. And his reasoning was, as long as the government was doing everything they could for these young men, he wasn't going to burden it with the layer of a union on top of it. So it's kind of an interesting dichotomy there. So, but being a Southerner, he did tend to lead toward the Jim Crow laws, which were still around at the time. And if a community complained about a black camp being placed near them, he didn't challenge it. He simply moved the unit to another area, usually to federal or army lands. Yet it also, at the same time, he appears to have done what he could to improve the African-American condition within limits imposed by Congress, because that is one thing. He had to work within what he was given. So again, he's kind of a complex man, what I say a product of his time. But as I said, segregation was policy, but it did not become official policy until July of 1935. And that was due to political pressure, particularly from Southern states in Congress, in that they ordered Fechner, and he had to order this. After this July 1935, all black units had to be officially segregated, unless of an exception like a few of those as I talked about already with the integrated units. Also, enrollees had to remain within their home state. They could not be shipped out to other states. Now, this had actually been a rule at the beginning, but it was never really enforced until this July of 35. And those that were out of state were either transferred back to their home state or simply given discharges. And a lot of that was the Southern states didn't want other state people in their states, which was a lot of why that was driven. Also, no new camps could be established with new recruits. So they couldn't take a group of new recruits and establish a new camp. However, they could take current enrollees and establish new camps. And I'll talk a bit more about this with Pennsylvania in a moment. And recruitment could only replace vacancies in black companies. They couldn't form totally new companies. They simply would replace vacancies within existing companies. And again, this will have a little bit of play in a moment. So what we look at with the CCC program in general, what I call opportunities missed and ideals compromised. The downside was that the restricted enrollment kept African-American youth from fully benefiting from the program. It limited advancement and educational opportunities afforded to black enrollees. Social attitudes at the time prevented the CCC from encouraging greater integration of African Americans into mainstream society. On the upside, in the same thing of opportunities missed and ideals compromised, in spite of that, small successes did lead to larger ones years later. For enrollees, it did give them a leg up in civilian life. The few integrated units came a decade before the Army's first integrated units in World War II. So the Army kind of kept an eye on these integrated units and found out that, yes, they could work. So it led to the first integrated units within the military. It did fulfill at least some of its obligation towards this unemployed group, and it set the stage for civil rights legislation in the decades to follow. In leadership, many became educational directors, medical officers, and chaplains. That was the initial jobs they were allowed to have. Some Army Reserve black officers were put in charge later on, and again, it showed the Army that it would work. And I think the most incredible part of this legacy is this gentleman. And as I often tell about people when I talk about the CCC, we often refer to the men who fought World War II as the greatest generation. And then I tag it with, well, where was the greatest generation weaned? It was weaned in the CCC. Here's an example, Herbert Thorpe. He and his brother were in the CCC in New York State. So we can't claim them in Pennsylvania, but they did come from New York State. Both of them would serve in the Tuskegee Airmen. And if you're not that familiar with it, it was an African-American military pilots and support personnel out of Tuskegee, Alabama. It was the first black military aviators in the U.S. Armed Forces and one of the most highly respected fighter groups of World War II. And this group really paved the way for full integration in the military. So this is kind of the mixed legacy of the CCC, where it did produce men of this caliber that really helped the war effort in World War II. So when I look at this, I look at it as other historians, they seem to agree that the African-American experience in the program needs to be the true subject of scholarly research. And the few articles there are on life, discrimination, segregation, other parameters, there are a few of them out there, but it's something that could really be explored more. And so what I find in my limited research on this is that they reveal that much information is incomplete, lacking in error, and doesn't really give a true picture. I also find a lot of what is there is often layered with stereotyping, generalization, bias, and such, and that may play a role in some of it. And so my research is kind of focused on sorting out the number and location of these units in Pennsylvania. And this is where I had a shout out to John. As I said, we just lost him this week. Now here I'm going to pause for a moment if we have any questions. Is there anything, Josh, in the chat or anything? Because I can't see the chat with full screen.
There's nothing in the chat right now. If you would like to ask a question relative to what's been presented so far, you can type your name in the chat. If you'd rather ask it by just asking it with your voice, let me know that in the chat, and I can unmute you. I'll give it just a few seconds here. Otherwise, we will move along. There don't appear to be any questions coming in, Paul, so I would say please continue.
All righty. Well, while we talk about companies and such, I just need to do a few notations here. The camps were given numbers, say like S-62, and the prefix letters indicate the type of a camp it was. The ones I'll be talking about tonight are listed, these 7 different listings. A and F camps are in the Allegheny National Forest. S camps are state forest, for instance. NP is a national park camp. SP, state park, MP military park, those are the original designations, but later on they were all reclassified as NP camps, national park camps. You have private land camps and army base camps. We also had different types of companies. Often, because the Army basically administered the program, the Army ran things the Army way. And so the companies were given numbers and letter designations if they were beyond the normal white companies. They would only have a number like 360th company, something like that. If it had a company like 361C, it meant that they were a colored unit. V were veterans. CV meant colored veterans. And then we also have women. Yes, there were female CCC members. Only a few camps, most of them in the Washington, D.C. area. And what I heard one time, and I heard this from John and some others, that they were called the she's. But there were women camps, and there was also American Indian camps, which were designated with I. There were none of those companies in Pennsylvania, but there were colored veteran and colored veteran units. So now, we have their, by late 1935, the peak of the program, according to history, is about 2,000 black enrollees. However, I have also found some newspaper accounts which suggest it could be as high as 4,000. Again, these numbers, I don't have them confirmed one way or the other. I'm just throwing both of them out there. However, it seems, from what I do find, is that perhaps it said it's more than any other state. So Pennsylvania seems to have about the highest number. In Pennsylvania, the average enrollment number is slightly larger than the state population. I think the state population was around 8.5, 8.75% at the time. And so a couple times it did exceed 9%. So it was slightly more in Pennsylvania. However, the numbers dropped after 1935 due to program restrictions. And I find newspaper accounts of local recruiters begging for increased allotments. And Pennsylvania Congress people would try to go to Congress and get these increases, and it just would not happen. And so PA officials were stymied by the dictates and inflexibility. And a lot of this, again, was the Army, which was determined to keep the black enrollment to as minimum as possible. So now, establishing the camps, as I said, they're known as colored camps and colored units. Tended to be in remote areas. For the camps, they were, as I said, they were segregated. In Pennsylvania, they were always, and after 35, it was official. They had white officers and such. Now, to give you an idea, here's some statistics I found. In Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, Black youth made up about 25% of the local relief rolls. However, only 8% was allowed by quota. So you can see kind of what was happening in Pennsylvania. It is said that Pennsylvania could establish 3 times as many camps as they actually had in order to handle this need. So the Army put up barriers, and the federal government did too, but Pennsylvania, in my research, I found some interesting things. For instance, in addition to constantly petitioning to increase quotas, they officially objected to Fechner's restrictions. I'm also finding that Pennsylvania found these creative runarounds to these restrictions, and again, I'll illustrate that here in a few moments. And Pennsylvania seems to have done everything it could to maintain as many Black as possible in the program, even up to the very end. Now, conventional history, if you look at most of the histories, they very emphatically report that there were 12 African-American camps in Pennsylvania. Nothing to back this up. It just simply states there were 12. According to John Eastlake, he has documented Pennsylvania as having 153 camps, which leads us to a ratio of approximately 1 in 13 camps were Black. Now, as I said, this is the conventional history. Because both John and I started finding some things. But first off, I want to show you this. What is the source for this 12 number? Nobody seemed to have recorded a source for it in all these history, but I finally found a history that sourced it. It was a letter dated June 7th, 1934. That is at the end of the first year of the CCC program. That's taking a photograph at one point in time and using that photograph to represent the entire 8 years of the program. What has happened is that number has been used by later researchers to represent the total number of African-American camps in Pennsylvania. They simply just resuscitate and regurgitate that number 12. In my research, interestingly enough, I can only account for 11 camps by that date. An Army base camp. I have not yet been able to access the letter because of the COVID restrictions to get somebody into the state archives. Right now. But otherwise, I can only account through other sources 11 of those 12 camps. So it makes me wonder what that other. So my research, and John and I had talked about this because we started both questioning this 12 number. Remember, here again, 153 camps in Pennsylvania. The number I have documented so far is 30. That is defined as having at least one colored unit occupy the camp during its active service life. That's a pretty much higher number than 12. And that is a ratio of 1 to 5. That's a much higher ratio than what is traditionally said. 42. The longest lived camp was at 7.5 years. That was Camp S76. The shortest one was A2 at 1 month. The most colored camps lasted on average 2.5 to 3.5 years, which, by the way, is pretty typical. That's about the typical life for any camp in Pennsylvania. I have found that 3 of the 30 camps were actually known to have been objected to. One was at Stoddardsville, Luzerne County. They were there for 3 months and moved. One at Tobyhanna, and then one at Po Valley, where it was a company that was ordered to transfer to there. They were being transferred from another camp nearby in Mifflin County. While some people over in Center County were petitioning their Congress people to keep this Black veterans company from going to Po Valley, Mifflin County was lobbying hard for the camp not to be relocated because the local people really liked this company and they were very much integrated into the community. I have in Pennsylvania, it's kind of like the chart that I have. It gives some basic information on these. The red numbers and dates are the dates that the black units were in these particular companies or camps. And these are the ones that had multiple units in it. So this is kind of like the sum of my research to this point. If you want a graph, here's a graph of the camps that had black companies in it. Now we're in the lower part where you see kind of the light gray, they were the white companies, and then later these camps had black companies in them. If you see the orange line in the middle of 1934, that's that letter. It states 12 camps. So it gives you an idea of where that was within the program. So if you look at the graph, you can see that from late 35 to about 37, the end of 37 is really the peak of the program when you kind of had the most number of camps. And these are a listing of all the companies that, that were either colored companies or colored veterans. So when we talk about the companies, in 1933, there were 9 companies that were formed in that the first few months of the program. Now, this is when some restrictions, they started to kind of clamp down on it a little bit. But what happened is that Pennsylvania in 1934 took 2 white companies and they transferred or discharged all but the white officers of them and then refilled the unit with new black recruit. And so they went from a white company to a black company. Well, evidently, I think that Pennsylvania probably got their fingers slapped for that. And so in 1935, there were 6 companies formed out of Fechner's new rules, prohibiting new companies with recruits. So what they did was, Pennsylvania took 3 existing black companies, split them in half to form 2 companies, each only half filled, and then filled the vacancies. Remember I said the runaround? Kind of like the creative runarounds they did to try to get more enrollment. This is how they did it. No new companies, though, were formed after 1935. Evidently, that kind of got shot down again. So there's no new companies, but they did continue to fill many of these companies as best they could. But the companies start to go down in number because of the general decrease in the budget of the program. This gives you a graph chart of the companies. And again, the orange line in 1934 shows that letter. But again, you can see the peak is in that 35 to 37 period. But if you look clear over to the right end of the chart, you can see 3 of the companies going, actually 4 going into 1934. This is the CCC map of Pennsylvania. The black circles around the camp numbers are the ones that were colored only, and the red ones are white and colored camps. So it kind of gives you an idea of their distribution. Most of them seem to be in north central Pennsylvania. So we're going to take a quick tour of some of these camps. The first one we're going to talk about is Penn Roosevelt. As I said, that's one of the parks that we manage. It was originally called the Stone Creek Kettle Camp. Very often in the CCC, camps have multiple names. Part of that comes from when, like, Department of Forest and Waters established a camp. The first thing they did was give the camp a name, and it was given a number. When the unit went into it, they were allowed to choose their own name for the camp. And sometimes as companies change and a new company come in, they would rename it. So there are camps that had several companies that have 4 or 5 different names attached to them. Anyway, this is in Center County, Harris Township. The nearest town is Milroy in Mifflin County. It ran from May of 1933 to the end of October 35. There are visible remains in the park, like fireplaces and a bake oven. They built the dam and facilities at Penn Roosevelt. Right now, the dam is drained because the dam has leaked. Penn Roosevelt was actually a state forest park administered under the Bureau of Forestry until 1983, when it was transferred to state parks. The company was organized at Fort Meade in Maryland. In 35, they were transferred to a former veterans camp near Beaver Springs, and finally disbanded in December of 1936. This is the portrait shot of the company. This only turned up a few years ago. John Eastlake had managed to turn this up for us. Before that, we didn't have it, but this is the entire company. The Army would hire photographers, and then he would go around and take entire group shots like this. So there's a lot of these pictures around. Also, for the camps that are in my local area, I created base maps for them. This is the base map of the Penn Roosevelt camp. You can see the lake and the buildings about where the camp was located. These are some other pictures. When these camps were first established, they used old surplus Army material. So these were squad tents. They would often go in and set up a tent city. And then later on, as the camp got established, they would go in and build barracks for them and permanent buildings. This is the flagpole and assembly area in the camp. This is the mess hall. The fact it has scaffolding around it makes us think that this picture was taken right about the time it was completed. This building is the old rec hall. The photograph the annual, and interestingly enough, this page had several photographs on it that were implied to be of the Beaver Springs camp. However, if you see the fireplace and chimney in it, I noticed that the pattern of white and dark stones matched the chimney out at Penn. Wearing the hat, he was one of LEM's. These are pictures from his collection that he donated to us many years ago. Here he is on the left. This was out on they were doing some logging. Some of the forestry supervisors in the program. I also contacted the National Archives and got some there was a file of materials on this camp. A couple of the materials included menus from the camp, so you got to see. One thing that the CC boys often said was, when they joined, they got 3 hots and a cot. And nationally, on average, the average CCC member in the first 3 months of enrollment gained 18 pounds. Now, balance that against that, what they were doing was hard physical manual work. They didn't have a lot of equipment to do it. They did everything by hand. They built roads by taking sledgehammers and picks. And yet they still gained 18 pounds in the first 3. Gives you an idea of the different classes that were on. And these are some of the remains of the camp. Remember I said about that fireplace? This, the picture on the right, is a fireplace, and it has an iron back on the back of it. So it serves kind of as a monument to the camp. The bottom left was a stone to be the first black camps established in the country. It was basically April 33 to January 36 when it was disbanded. They renamed theirs Camp New Deal. What was unusual about this camp was they were in an area that had a lot of blighted chestnut. And so the boys actually built most of the buildings here out of chestnut logs rather than out of the typical tar paper and frame construction of most CCC buildings. When the camp was closed, these cabins most of them were torn apart and the logs were salvaged, and they were sold off, and other people used them to build hunting camps and such. One thing I like to note, and you can see it well in this picture, and if there's any old Army veterans that are in the audience tonight, you should be able to appreciate this. You can notice the Army influence on the camp, particularly the straight as a string rock pad, the rock line paths. And if you notice, they're all kind of painted white. And I've had Army veterans tell me, yeah, when you're in the Army, you had nothing to do. What did you do? Paint rocks. So you can see that same type of influence in the CCC camps. Even though the men themselves were not in the military, they still were kind of under a semi-military discipline. And the Army, again, did things the Army way to administer the camps. It's out on a work crew. A lot of them, too, is some of the young men in the camp were taught how to be cooks. And after their enrollment, they would go out and get jobs as cooks in restaurants and hotels and such. These are a couple of the surviving buildings of the camp today. These are now hunting camps. This next one is at Westford. This is the other black camp that's within a current boundary of a state park. This one's out in Pymatuning, out in the western part of the state. And it went in there in 1938 and transferred out in 1939 and disbanded in 41. I don't have a lot of pictures of this, but there is a couple pictures of the camp. This is from the 1936 annual. This was the first annual they did, by the way. They didn't do any before that. These are some remains of the camp today. These were sent to me by the lady that's in one camp. She was my counterpart out of Pymatuning. She retired last year. Camp Strait, also known as Wilcox, was in Crawford County. Again, it was out near Westford. And it was 35 to 41 again, a couple different locations. And some of these things I'm just kind of skipping over. I don't need to go over in detail. If you want to watch the recording of it later on, you can do and stop it, pause it to see all those other details. But here's a panoramic picture of the camp. State camp was up at Renova, and it was first occupied by Color Unit in 1934, and it lasted until March of 1942. This was one of the family days that they had at the camp. They also helped with the 1936 flood out there in one of the communities. And this is a marker that's at the site of the camp today. There were two camps at Gettysburg, MP1 and MP2. These were there starting in 1933. The first one closed in 37, but the second one lasted until April 1942. And they did a lot of work on the battlefield. This particular company said to be somewhere else, but I have no dates or evidence of that. The first company was actually out of New York State and was sent down, but then they were transferred back after a few months. And then another company was put in there and stayed there until 1942. At that time, this particular company was transferred to the Owls Gap camp near Whipple Dam. For this camp, in 1936, it had the first black officers to take over administration. In 1939, this was the first black company in the whole United States with all black officers. So this was kind of pioneered in Pennsylvania. And again, it showed the Army that, yes, the blacks could indeed lead other men. And it kind of dispelled that myth that the Army had that they couldn't do that. Here are some pictures of it. Again, they started out with tents. In some cases, the enrollees built some of their buildings. In other cases, they brought in local carpenters and contractors to do it. This is they're doing work on the battlefield, building gravel paths. They had a baseball team. A lot of the camps had sports teams. They had baseball and they had basketball. The Army didn't particularly allow them to have football because of the higher propensity for injuries. Particularly, they didn't have as much protective gear at the time. So the Army kind of frowned on football, but they were allowed to do baseball and basketball. They also had boxing teams. Here's a couple of them kind of jokingly sparring around at one of the camps down at Gettysburg. And here the men are working on resetting the grave markers in the National Cemetery. They're working out along one of the roads. This is a company at Austin, Pennsylvania, also known as Bark Shanty. Established in 1905 or 1935 and lasted to 1942. This one's in Potter County. This one is not too far from the Lumber Museum. This was one of the last two color companies to disband at the end of the program. And to end the program tonight, I have a rare treat for you. Well, it seems that nationally, that actual film footage of the CCC is rare. So imagine how very rare it is to have film footage from an African-American camp. Well, it so happens that we do have some from the Austin camp. This was found many years ago by John Eastlake and digitized. So while the film is silent, so while it's playing, we can take any questions from the chat or verbally and such. So this is the film that was taken in the camp.
As by way of information, this camp would have been less than 20 miles southwest of where the Pennsylvania Lumber Museum is today.
Josh, you're breaking up.
Yeah, my internet connection seems to be incredibly poor this evening.
Josh, could you repeat that because you were breaking up? Do we have any questions from the chat, John? Or Josh, I can't see the chat right now.
I don't know. Can you hear me now? My internet keeps going in and out.
Yes. Brenda is asking, are there any landmarks?
Like forest firefighting techniques. They did soil conservation work. In about 1935 or so, they partnered with the Soil Conservation Service and had what they called SCS camps. Out in the Midwest, the CCC literally ended the Dust Bowl by helping farmers learn about soil conservation, planting windbreaks, and doing other things. They essentially, they're credited with the Dust Bowl. Other things they did, they built water systems for communities, strung phone lines. They developed 800 state and local parks nationwide, worked in many of the national parks, building some of the lodges in the national parks were built by them. They built a couple thousand miles of hiking trails throughout the country. I mean, I think I read a figure one time where they, in 1940 dollars, they did over $4 billion worth of work. Now imagine what that would be today with inflation. They also planted trees. One of their nicknames was Roosevelt's Tree Army. The CCC planted about 3 billion trees in 8 years. And that almost, if let's say today, the president said, I'm going to create a program on the massive scale of this, how long do you think it would take to actually get on the ground running? You know, do you think it would happen in a reasonable amount of time? Well, in 1933, from the time Roosevelt announced his idea to the first camp open was 40 days. Now, in that 40 days, it had to be approved by Congress, had to be funded by them. You had to get the military to ramp up to establish camps, the Department of Labor to recruit the men. You had to have the men go to indoctrination centers of the Army in order to process them and equip them. You had to round up tents and, you know, tools and mess gear and everything else. You had to get the unions off the back of the government on it. You had to get local communities involved in it, that they welcomed these camps. You had to have the Departments of Interior and Agriculture select projects for them. Now, all this was done in 40 days. Can you imagine in today's world, the government moving at that speed? I mean, it's incredible. I think of how it's been on the ground running in a short period of time.
People to get outside and get to the parks. So they built recreation parks and cabins and camps for civilian use. And then also there are still some of the existing camps that they lived in that were later just incorporated into the state park and used as recreation camps as well.
French Creek and Blue Knob state parks both have existing CCC camp buildings. I don't know how complete they are, but I do know that they do have some building. See, if you look at most of these like buildings here, these are simple, you know, simple structures. They were only designed to last a few years. They were not meant to be permanent structures. Their siding was nothing more than tar paper. And they were just simple frame structures with what they had a paneling on the inside called beaver board, which is kind of an early type of homosode almost, made out of wood fiber. And so they weren't elaborately built buildings. They weren't even on complete foundations. Most of the times they were just on stone pillars. So they were actually only designed to last a few years. And for about the life of camp, for about 5 years maybe. And oftentimes the buildings were disassembled and moved to another camp and rebuilt to try to recycle them, because materials were often expensive and hard to come by during the Great Depression. So they would sometimes recycle some of the structures, or at least recycle the wood out of it and use them to rebuild other things. And they were often built on common plans too. Like, you know, most of the camps, the buildings have a very much an architectural similarity to them because they were built on military designs. They simply used them rather than, now each camp was often laid out in a unique way to the lay of the land, but the buildings themselves often conform to these standard designs.
Let's see. There's Gloria's asking, saying her African-American father went through basic training at Indiantown Gap
Okay.
in the early 50s. Does that have any connections to the camps that you've discussed?
There was a CCC camp down there, but I don't think it was a black camp.
I will say that at Indiantown Gap, there was a CCC reception center, which was, and this center, so not all Pennsylvania men served in Pennsylvania. There's a greater supply of men than need, even for the large amount of camps that we had. And some Pennsylvania men went off to the west, such as off to New Mexico. So Indiantown Gap was where these men gathered and received some training before going off west. And there was also a cook's school at Indiantown Gap, where some CCC men went to get specific cook training. I don't know if that would have been an integrated just because of the small amount of men who would have used it or not, but that's what happened.
As soon as I go out of this, I'll go and look and see if the Indiantown Gap is in my list of black camps. I'll take a look. I can't look at it right now. Give me a moment here, but just in conclusion here, I just wanted to say the CCC program provided a means for unemployed youth to find purpose and learn self-discipline and work ethics. It was the weaning of the greatest generation of World War II. For those African Americans who were in it, it was a leg up. But the program never fully lived up to its potential, but it did pave the way for integration in the military, minority officers and authority, and civil rights legislation. And that Pennsylvania went above and beyond to help minority enrollees to the best of their ability within established rules. So I'll drop out of this, and if I can still take some questions here. One second.
Also, there's another question. Have there been any oral histories or interviews with African-American CCC participants in Pennsylvania?
Well, actually, I did one many years ago of a gentleman who was in the Penn Roosevelt camp. I interviewed him. He was a black enrollee, and I do have his interview out at the park. I didn't incorporate it into this as of yet, but I did do that. I also interviewed the gentleman who gave us the pictures of Penn Roosevelt to kind of get the perspective of that camp. I'm not aware, just off the top of my head, if there are others that did do that, although it is possible. John could have interviewed, I know he interviewed several people in his years, but I can't say, specifically off the top of my head that I know of any. Now, let me look here and see if it was a colored camper at Indiantown Gap.
I can say all I know is that we do not have any such interviews at the Lumber Museum.
Yeah. So I said I did that one many years ago. Both of those gentlemen have are now deceased, but I did back probably in the early 90s interview both of them.
Question from Chad: Is the video of Austin posted online anywhere?
That I don't know. I don't know if John put that up or somebody else put that up or what.
I want to say, if you have a digital copy, I don't have a copy of that. So
I can supply it to Josh.
Yeah.
I don't know if the other Josh has it. I see he's just a picture right now. And
yeah, he's been getting.
Yeah, he kind of faded out there. But yeah, if he doesn't have it, I'll be glad to supply it. Right now, state parks, we're not allowed to put anything up on YouTube. So seems every other state agency has a YouTube channel. State parks does not. So we're working on trying to get that permission, but I can certainly get it to him, and he could post it on your if you have a channel. I think you have a channel up there.
Yeah.
Yeah, you could put it up on your channel.
Yeah, PHMC has a channel, and the Lumber Museum has their own channel.
As I said, every other state agency has a channel. I think even forestry has a channel, but for some reason, state parks doesn't. But hopefully we'll get one. Yeah, I don't see any of the black camps. Yes, there is one. Yep, here it is. I thought it was at Grantville or Lickdale. It was known as by those names. S141. Active from June of 33 to June of 37. The black company was there was October 35 to June of 37. So that was first a white white camp, and then later a black camp.
All right. Well, I think we've gone a little over an hour here. If there's any final questions, but if not, I will just point out the Lumber Museum. We do have a very good sized collection for the CCC for the state in general. Unfortunately, our collection is very limited when it comes to African American experience in the CCC. What we do have are a few photographs that come from a couple of white commanding officers, so we don't even have anything directly to speak to the enrollees themselves. So I guess as the curator, I will just throw a plug out. If anybody knows of anything, I would love to be able to add it to our collection to help preserve and tell these stories.
Yeah, it's kind of the same with us down in our area. You know, I always put it out there, you know, if you have anything, because we have several camps, and of course with the Penn Roosevelt camp being part of the complex. All of the pictures that we got from came from basically the white officers in it. But certainly there should have been something, because they did have a PX in the camps, and pictures were taken and sold through the PX. I did run across a reference in a newspaper that Penn Roosevelt had a camp newsletter, but we have yet to turn up any copies of it. Most of the camps were encouraged to have their own newsletters, kind of like the camp newspaper. It was published about once a month. A lot of those can be found in collections. I think there's some of them that are online in free databases. You kind of have to poke around for them to find them, but they were encouraged to do that. They even hand drew ads and artwork and stuff in them, and they often give you a little bit of that life of the camp. Something too, if you're interested in the camp in your local area, I found this. Newspapers. Very often the camps had correspondents who would send the news of the camp to the local paper. We know a lot about the Penn Roosevelt camp because they had enrollees that would every week or every couple of weeks send a short letter to the local newspaper, and they would publish it as news of the camp. And so it gives us a little bit of life in the camp from the enrollees' perspective.
We do have some random sampling of newsletters from more of the white camps in our area. And actually, to kind of tie it in, this is some of the photos that we have, and there's about the Bark Shanty campus 46, and this little snippet is from the Lyman Run Ripples, which was the newsletter for the campus 88 Lyman Run, that talks about the establishment of the African American camp at Bark Shanty. And just some of our pictures from Colonel James Campbell, who is the commanding officer at Bark Shanty from May of 1939 to August of 1940. Just a little interesting about Colonel Campbell. He enlisted during World War I, was an officer for the CCC, was at Pearl Harbor in December 7th, was at the Berlin Airlift, and retired after a stint in Korea. So he kind of went all over with the Army. But these are some photographs from his collection.
Just to jump in there, on your bottom right, that gentleman in the middle that has the glasses in your previous picture.
Yes.
That's Charles Grinnell. He was an educational advisor. He was at Penn Roosevelt and also down at one of the Gettysburg camps, in addition to being at Bark Shanty. It's the guy standing in the front middle of your bottom picture with the glasses. Yeah, that's Charles Grinnell.
But we have some pictures. This is a Gerald Stark, who was a mess sergeant and later the company first sergeant. Interesting thing to point out is he's wearing the spruce green uniform, dress uniform, which would have been introduced in 1939. And 3 stripes there denote his rank of leader. A couple more selections from that camp. Again, just for time, just going relatively quickly. Then Colonel Campbell also had some pictures from Reedsville in his collection. As with Paul mentioned, this was a veterans camp. And these gentlemen were pictured earlier, but I noticed up here, this was on our picture, this was labeled as 10th Cavalry. So since this was a veterans camp, most likely these men were part of the 10th Cavalry during World War I, and the 10th Cavalry was one of the original Buffalo Soldier units. And then we also have a few photographs in our collection from MP3 Chancellorsville down in Virginia. These come from Colonel Black, Carl Black, who was a quartermaster at Camp S-133 Hammersley Fork in Pennsylvania. He gave us a lot of photographs from that camp, and these might have just been kind of mixed in with him, but he was the commander at MP3 in Chancellorsville, which was a colored camp. The camp MP3, which stood for Military Park, became MP11 National Park after the nation's battlefields were transferred from the War Department to the National Park Service. Again, just a couple of selections of that, and that pretty much is the extent of the collection of the Pennsylvania Lumber Museum as it relates to African Americans in the Civilian Conservation Corps.
I don't know if you can hear me and see me again. My internet seems to be back. Assuming that everyone can, I just want to say thank you very much to Paul for giving this presentation. A lot of great information in there. A lot of it went by very quickly. Paul, is it possible to get a copy of your PowerPoint in case folks have specific questions?
Yeah, what I'll do is I'll upload it into my personal Dropbox, and then I will send you a link to it so you can take it. I don't know if you heard, you kind of cut out there for a while, but the other Josh, I'll send you, if you don't have it, I'll send you the copy of that film that I showed at the end.
I did hear that, and I said, I put in the chat that if you send it to us, we will certainly be able to share that out on the PA Lumber Museum YouTube channel if other folks would like to view it again or share it with other people that they know.
Yeah.
And it's
it's
really surprising as many interactions as we've had with John Eastlake. He really helped to design the CCC portion of the exhibit in the Lumber Museum Visitor Center in 2015 during our redesign project. I don't ever remember him telling me about that video. I learned about it from you. So
I sometimes find historians are, they often are like, they are in a courtroom. They will give you what you ask for.
Right, right.
And well, when I was doing this, say, what do you have on black camps in Pennsylvania? We had another historian locally at the park. I mean, if you would say, hey, did you have any in Greenwood Furnace? And he goes, maybe, maybe not. But if you ask him about the certain person that was born on this date, he'd give you all kinds of information. So yeah, I think John just had so much, sometimes he didn't always think of it. But sometimes too, they don't like to let out everything that they have at one time.
Right.
It could just been he just didn't think about it.
His loss will be so profound to the study and understanding of the Civilian Conservation Corps in Pennsylvania, and it's just so tragic. But I'm thankful that we had him for when we did, and that he was able to help us as much as he did. We actually filmed some video footage with him over the summer in July, talking about the Dyer Farm CCC camp, which is in the southern part of Potter County near to us, and where the CCC cabin that we have at the museum came from. So that was a tremendous experience, and one that I will remember for the rest of my life.
I hope that he or his family thought about somewhere, you know, having his collection go to archive it for other people. It'd be a shame to see that tossed in a dumpster.
Well, his
Yes, I
wife,
hope-
you know, was involved, and I think she will do right by everything that he had.
Yeah, that's what I was hoping, that somewhere someone would take care, become custodian of that collection.
Well, again, thank you so much. This was a wonderful presentation. If there are no other questions, I think we will end things for the evening. As before, we have recorded this program. So if you know someone that you think would enjoy watching it after the fact, please feel free to share it out once we convert it and post it up to our website and social media. So again, happy Black History Month to everyone. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Josh. Thank you, everyone else that attended. And have a very good evening.
Thank you. Good night.